Looking at John Gray's description of liberalism, and so far we have been looking at his first ingredient of liberalism, and that is individualism. But we were trying to understand individualism in terms of the concept of freedom, and last time we saw that freedom is the central concept of liberalism, even more important than individualism and all other things, and that's why it's called liberalism. So we tried to last time understand the basic concept of freedoms in terms of positive freedom and negative freedom, um, and we saw that liberalism is a form of worship of freedom in both senses. And today we are going to continue looking at the concept of freedom from a slightly different angle than the last time. So today we want to look at the concept of freedom. When we talk about freedom, as we saw last time, we are talking about the freedom of the will, basically human will. And whether you understand will as rationally dominant will, or whether you think that desires are more important or overriding, that's all secondary. The main thing is, when you talk about freedom, when you talk about liberalism, you talk about freedom, and you talk about freedom, you're talking about freedom of human will or individual will. So liberalism in that sense is the doctrine which claims and promote freedom in both negative and positive senses, and this freedom is the property of human will. So in other words, liberalism is the doctrine which promotes the freedom of human will in both positive and negative sense. So the freedom of human will, it should be free from external constraints, factual, moral, social constraint as far as possible. So maximizing this. So that's the negative freedom of this will. And then creating a society in which this will is able to fulfill its plans. So it has resources for that, no outside constraint. Not all liberal, but there should be resources for this, and there shouldn't be any constraint for this will to positively will whatever it wants as long as it is compatible with the will of, or the right of the of a similar will. That's where human rights come. The purpose of human rights is to coordinate the action of equally free will in such a way that there's a minimum violation of other people's freedom. And that's where egalitarianism comes in, to which we will come after considering this first ingredient. Okay, so that's will. And in a sense, these characteristics that you have, you will whatever you will, and there are minimum constraints on your will. That's how, for example, conception of God is defined. In Abrahamic tradition, for example. For example, God is yafalu ma yasha according to Quran. He does whatever he wants. So in that sense, his will is absolutely free. And is qayyum, that is self-sustaining. And that self-sustenance is the key virtue in many liberal traditions as well. So in a sense, it's the characteristics of Abrahamic God, the freedom of will. In a sense, many authors have noted that liberal conception of human being is quite in the image of a Christian God or Abrahamic God, for example. So basically, liberal conception of self is a prototype of the Abrahamic conception of God. And this is clear from other liberal virtues as well, virtues or sin, as you would call in Abrahamic tradition. So the liberal self for a liberal self, it is blasphemous almost to surrender your will under a higher will. And two conceptions which are central to Abrahamic faiths, for example, worship. Which is loving surrender, loving and surrender full of the recognition of the majesty of this higher will, surrendering your will to that will. That conception of worship is totally alien to this liberal conception. Other conception which is alien to liberal self is the conception of submission. Submission to that higher will. Voluntary submission to that higher will. For example, that's what we call Islam, and you become Muslim by such submission. And in fact, the height or the excellence of this Islam, which is called Ihsan, is that you basically don't find any internal resistance to this submission. This is totally against the liberal ethos, because liberal ethos basically is self-submission, self-worship. So basically liberal a self obsessed with freedom, obsessed with freedom of her will, becomes basically incapable of two things at least: worship to a transcendental will and submission to that will. You don't have to actually deny God. You can still remain Muslim or Christian or Jewish. But if your ethos is a liberal ethos, it would become harder and harder for you to worship transcendental God, submit to a transcendental God, and even you will reinterpret those submissions as self-worship and self-submission, because your sole obsession is with your own self and gratifying your own self and your own will and realizing your own will. That's why a great liberal thinker, Immanuel Kant, for example, even though he was a nominally Christian, in fact he actually wrote a book, a long book to defend Christianity, a rational Christianity anyway. He actually hated, he hated the whole concept of worship to God. He thought that it was beyond human dignity to worship God, submit to God. And according to him, the basis of morality is submitting to your rational will. And Christianity doesn't consist in worshipping God for him or submitting to God, but Christianity consists in realizing that we are co-equal of God because we have a will like God. So our freedom is basically, and Kant realizes this, our freedom is our longing for becoming God or God-like. And worshipping freedom means trying to become God. And that's what he thinks our humanity consists in. So it's not just an abstract thought. At least some liberal thinkers did realize what uh, worshipping freedom actually implies. So just to go back to liberalism, it's a belief in individual freedom. Freedom means freedom from and freedom to. And this freedom is the freedom of individual will. Freedom from and freedom to. And liberal doctrine is a doctrine which believes in the absolute freedom of each and every individual will, as long as it is compatible with similar freedom for all other individual wills. And such a conception of self basically consists in gratifying yourself. And is increasingly incapable of worship and submission to a higher will, to a divine will. So basically, what liberalism really makes impossible in the long run is worshipping divine will and submitting to divine will without denying, without even rejecting the existence of God as such. But if you're a liberal, you will reinterpret submission to God as submission to your own self. That will make worship and submission impossible. And a society you will create would be a society in which everybody is obsessed with self-fulfillment rather than self-transcendence. So in such society, obviously, the tazkiyah and purification becomes impossible. Even the concepts become impossible. Okay. I think we should stop here and we'll continue with our analysis of freedom and will, because there's much to be looked at still in this concept of freedom and the concept of will and all that.